to get down to business. The most important thing, it's my great pleasure to introduce our panelists here tonight. Judith Heumann in the resplendent pink and Judy, who we've known for a number of years, and she is the Special Advisor for Disability Rights in the U.S. State Department. To her right is Charlotte McClain-Nhlapo, who's the Coordinator of Disability and Inclusive Development at the U.S. Agency for International Development, better known as USAID. And to my immediate right, Joe Sanson, my good friend and colleague. She is the Director of Monitoring, Evaluation, and Learning, Research, at Trickle, and their bios are all in the materials at your seat. So tonight we're going to have our discussion in sort of two parts. We have a short video to kind of tee up our thinking, and I will then moderate a discussion for about 40 minutes with the panelists. And I hope you have questions, but if you won't mind kind of saving them, then we'll have plenty of time for questions and discussion and conversation, importantly. We want this to be a two-way dialogue, and we aim to complete the evening by about 8 o'clock. So again, thanks for being here. And now let's have a look, because we have two screens, at a short video about 3 minutes that'll tell you a bit about Trickle Up's work on poverty and disability, and with a particular focus on a program that we just completed recently in Guatemala. It was funded by USAID, which has been a great partner to us in our disability work, not only in Guatemala, but in Mali in the past. And so without further ado, roll tape.
Magdalena is a strong and motivated woman who lives in a mountainous, rural area outside of Nhlapo, Guatemala. For most of her life, Magdalena's family has kept her at home, creating a dynamic of dependence in a community with a strong stigma against people with disabilities. From time to time, she's been able to earn some money doing low-wage contract weaving work for an aunt. Although she has a wheelchair, her mobility and access to economic opportunity are significantly restricted by the hilly terrain and social dynamics around her home. Trickle Up works to inspire and support the poorest and most vulnerable to build sustainable livelihoods and take their first transformative steps out of ultra-poverty. With the right tools, seed capital to start a small enterprise, the knowledge to use it productively, social connections with one another, and self-confidence, women living in ultra-poverty can build brighter futures for themselves and their families. Magdalena is one of 320 participants of Trickle Up's Microenterprise Opportunities for People with Disabilities program. Since 2010, Trickle Up has been implementing a USAID-funded project with people with disabilities in rural areas of Guatemala, where NGOs, government programs, and other initiatives generally don't include women like Magdalena and their families. Mentoring and training from Trickle Up's partner staff helps participants with disabilities build livelihoods that generate income. Through this process, participants' confidence grows and they are able to lead more autonomous lives. For most participants, engaging in productive activities not only improves their economic situation, but also their position within their household and community, as family members see and value their contributions. Through their business relationships and savings group activities, Trickle Up participants become visible, capable members of their communities, helping to foster a greater acceptance of disability. When we visited Magdalena a few months ago, she was sitting on the dirt floor of her home, with a backstrap loom strapped around her waist, and emerging from her diligent work, a brilliant blue weaving with the image of a lion. With her own thread, she is currently weaving and selling clothing to buyers that frequent her community. Her earnings are steadier and significantly greater than the sporadic contract work she had before. But Magdalena is not satisfied. Her long-term plan is to save enough to buy the food cart she wants and employ the help she needs to grow. With clear goals and the confidence to achieve them, Magdalena's transformation speaks to her singular drive to better her circumstances and her overarching dream of independence. Trickle Up thanks the United States Agency for International Development and the American people for their generosity and support.
some of the good work that we've done together. Perhaps you can start by talking a little bit about what USAID is doing in regards to disability inclusion. Foreign aid in general often takes a beating in public perceptions. So here's a chance to remind people what our money as taxpayers and what this agency is doing, and is related to that, if you could also talk a little bit about what your specific job and role is within the agency.
Great. Well, thank you, Bill, and I also would really like to congratulate Trickle Up in advance of the award that will be handed over next week at the Interaction Forum. I think the key mission of USAID is to focus on ending extreme poverty. And within that, we've looked, there are various sectors that program and develop policies in order to address the issue of extreme poverty. My position as coordinator for disability inclusive development is a new position. It was a position that was set up by the current administration. And so both Judy and I are political appointees. And my role is to find ways within the agency to integrate disability into all of our programs. But it's not just our programs. It's integrating disability into our policies, programs, and then very importantly, our practice. So what does that really mean? So what it means is I work across the board with people who are working in the education sector or the health sector or the economic development sector, and find ways for how we can include disability in their programming and in their policies. We have specific funding that's set aside to support disability-related or targeted programs, but the goal really is to ensure that we are integrating disability into all of the work that the agency is doing. And that's a challenge. That's a challenge for a number of reasons. I think one area that I find to be a challenge is getting colleagues at USAID to understand why it's important to include persons with disabilities, or actually more how to include persons with disabilities. So providing the technical assistance on what would an inclusive school look like, what would inclusive healthcare services look like, what would a microfinancing program that's inclusive look like. And so really presenting, my job is really to present good practices and to help colleagues think through various aspects of how to do this. And to that end, we've developed a course within the agency that colleagues can take, and it really gives you kind of the 101 on disability inclusive development. Because my experience has been that people are not, it's not that people are not willing to include persons with disabilities. They either haven't considered it as a development issue. I mean, they may see it as an important issue, but they haven't quite made the connection with development. And then when they do, the next best question is, well, how do we do it? And so, you know, I know Michael's come up to DC for a couple of meetings that we've had on extreme poverty, and it's really saying to colleagues, these are the entry points. You know, if you're working on a Feed the Future program, where, you know, you're providing nutrition and food, have you thought about what this means for persons with disabilities? And it's not just to say, well, we don't discriminate, because that's not good enough. There have to be deliberate, targeted programs that recognize some of the nuances around the experiences persons with disabilities experience in the countries in which we work.
And money is always a challenge in Washington.
Money is always a challenge.
So to do this well, is this something that would require great heaps of money for USAID, or do you see a way that a great deal can be accomplished in the very budget-constrained environment that we all live in?
So, you know, I very often hear folks saying, we'll work on disability if you give us additional budget. And my response to that is no. I mean, you wouldn't say that if you were thinking about another marginalized group, right? You wouldn't say we'll work on gender if you give us an additional budget. You find a way to include women and girls and persons with disabilities in the budget that you already have. So it's really about planning from the get-go And the example that I like to use is the one of schools. So if you build schools and you don't build them in an accessible fashion, you build steps, you build inaccessible bathrooms, and then you have a principal that comes along 3 years later and thinks, hey, maybe we should actually think about access. It's a lot more expensive to retrofit a school than it is to build a school from the get-go in an accessible fashion. In fact, the World Bank did a study that showed that the addressing inclusion issues or access issues only cost between 1 to 3% of the overall program budget. So it's really not a budget issue. It's an issue of being deliberate about inclusion. And I think the other point to think about is the cost of exclusion is so much more than the cost of inclusion. I mean, if you exclude and continue to exclude 15% of the world's population, the ramifications of that are that you're going to have costs down the road. If you from the beginning think, how do we ensure that our HIV and AIDS programming includes persons with disabilities, our education includes people with disabilities, our microfinance programs, then you're including people from the beginning. So I would really argue that it's not an issue of budget, but it's more an issue of planning effectively. That said, I think it's also important to flag that budgets do come. You have to factor budgets in to the picture. So you may need budgets for reasonable accommodations, for instance. But again, this is a really small part of what the overall budget would look like. So I don't buy the budget argument.
Judy, you've worked for many years in many different contexts, international, State Department, World Bank, also in domestic settings. What are the most common myths, misperceptions, outright falsehoods and lies that you've run into when you go out and talk to a general population about the whole range of issues related to disability?
So I think we're really looking at different conversations in different settings.
Mm-hmm.
So in countries like the United States, where there have been laws that have been developed for the last number of decades, what the conversation was in the 70s or 80s, depending on which country you're working in, is a very different discussion than the discussion we have today. So, the discussions in the 1970s when we were first working on developing regulations for a law called Section 504, which prohibited discrimination against disabled individuals in any program receiving money from the federal government. At that time, organizations like the American Public Transit Association argued very strongly that we should spend no money on making buses accessible or trains accessible because disabled people would never use them. There was a letter actually that had been circulated in New York which said, it would be much better to provide everybody with door-to-door service because disabled people are not going to be able to get to the bus or use the train. So that discussion was one that resulted in numerous demonstrations around the United States and obviously speaking very strongly against the policies that this particular umbrella organization was trying to develop. And a couple of years ago, I was at a conference at the Department of Transportation, which had an international focus on transportation, and one of the same people who had vociferously argued against accessible transportation now was singing the praises of accessible transportation.
Over what period of time?
So that was in the 70s until about 2009 or 10.
So it took a good 30 years to get.
Yeah. I don't know that it would have taken that long, but that's when the conference happened. But I think it would say that then when the Americans with Disabilities Act came in, there was a requirement that all public buses were going to have to be, all new buses being purchased would have to be accessible. We found out, so I want to make a couple of points. One is, in the United States and countries around the world, basically, as disabled people are coming together, there are a whole host of issues that we're trying to address. And I think it's fair to say that many of us came in as generalists. And our objective was to get the government to, or governments to acknowledge that discrimination existed and that it was important to pass legislation that made it illegal to discriminate based on disability, and that there would be repercussions. The individual themselves or government could in fact file complaints, etc. So when we finally got some of these major laws passed and regulations developed in the 1970s, we realized that it was really important. We couldn't be generalists anymore because we needed to have people who were able to have substantive discussions with the transportation industry, for example, because we were arguing low-floor buses. We needed people who really understood the difference in the buses and the differences in terrain, and that was the same as in areas of education, inclusive education, employment, reasonable accommodations. We needed to become as knowledgeable, if not more knowledgeable, than people in the field, because the people in the field, regardless of the country that you're in, are respected more, and people will believe what they have to say more than people who are considered advocates and are not really looking at the broad term policy implications, fiscal implications. And if you get back to what I was saying earlier, when looking at the issue of making buses accessible, the argument that we could spend all of this money and nobody would use the buses, so let's spend the money more wisely. But in fact, what we see over and over again is as disabled people, I was having this great conversation yesterday with someone from Lebanon and someone from India and someone from another country, all of whom are under 38, all of whom have disabilities, and all of whom now have degrees in areas that in the past disabled people weren't getting degrees in. So the knowledge that people now have, you see it developing all over Africa and Asia and Latin America. You have people who came in as disability rights advocates who now are gaining substantive information so that they in fact can begin to lay out an economic argument about why it's important that disabled people not be excluded. And I think, one of the critical issues that we've been working on is really moving away from the charity model, because I think it's very fair to say that one of the biggest issues that disabled people face around the world is that of stigma. And disabled people really represent the frailty of non-disabled people. So, men aren't going to be, tomorrow wake up as women. People of different colors or different religions, who you may have disparate feelings about, are not going to move into those groups unless they wish to. But in the area of disability, one can acquire a disability of many different types in a second. And so I think that sense of frailty has been a problem. And I think the other issue has been that in countries like the US, Canada, more countries in Africa and Asia now also, in Latin America, you're beginning to see, as I've been saying, more disabled people out and about in the community. But before that really happens in earnest, in rural areas as well as urban areas, people think that disabled people cannot contribute. People, as a rule, do not realize that if disabled people are not going to school and they're not being taught how to read or write or do math, that they're going to have the same problems that anyone would have if they weren't given those opportunities. And I think Trickle Up is a perfect example, because when you discuss Magdalena, so here you had a young woman who was highly stigmatized, who was being given charity by being able to do some menial work now and then when it was thrown to her. But when she was trained and given the opportunity, really excelled in what she was doing and has dreams and visions of what she should do. Those stories, I think, are really important. I think what's also really important is that development institutions, and like the State Department, USAID, the World Bank, etc., really need to be held accountable. And I think that's slowly happening. But one of the big issues that we face, as Charlotte was beginning to discuss earlier, is while we're able to demonstrate to more and more people that disabled people should be granted opportunities to be able to benefit in their societies and be able to achieve their human rights. People do not have the level of knowledge and experience about how to do things. So when looking at building accessible schools or building roads that are accessible or hiring people into various jobs, it's very important, I think, that we're able to really help share substantive knowledge and information, both with civil societies around the world and government, and not just the disability community. But it's really important when following this model of the inclusion of disability in development, but there also has to be, which I think Interaction has been working on for many years now, a much greater emphasis on expecting that all entities that are doing development work are becoming knowledgeable so that they can effectively be integrating disability into their work. I mean, if we look 30, 40 years ago, where issues of girls and women were around the world, the conditions were much worse then than they are today. Now we clearly know that if we keep moving forward, that all girls and women around the world can make great achievements, but have to be able to have certain opportunities in order to be able to make those achievements. And it's the same thing for disabled girls and women too.
And later on, come back to this notion of sort of how we hold institutions accountable, what would be our kind of test. But something you said suggests a question, Joe, I hope you can talk about the matter of stigma and discrimination and how that factors into the whole equation, and in particular what we've learned at Trickle Up, because our main focus is around economic livelihoods and saving and very specific things. And I think we found as we got deeper into this that the whole issue of stigma, perception, relationships with other people is really critical factor for success. So maybe we can talk about that, and particularly our experience in Guatemala and Mali and other places, as well as other places we work.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that we and our staff who work on the ground very often see in a very clear way is that this relationship between extreme poverty and disability is very strong. I mean, the statistics tell it, say it very clearly. If you have a disability, you're much more likely to be living in extreme poverty. You live in extreme poverty, and you're much more likely to acquire a disability. And we see that again and again, where people we've had program participants who have fallen off the back of pickup trucks because that's the only way you get around in very poor places, and sustained head injuries and so on. Untreated ear infections leading to permanent hearing impairments, as well as a moderately poor family being plunged into extreme poverty because of a disability. But we also, as part of that equation, certainly is the stigma and discrimination, that people who have the potential to be economically productive are often denied that opportunity because of the views of people around them and their communities and families about the ability for them to be economically productive, and also they end up internalizing that as well often. I think particularly people who are born with disabilities, they grow up in households feeling with a self-identity of being a burden and as being damaged as the way that they're seen by others. And I don't think we really came to fully understand the depth of this stigma until we really started implementing projects and seeing how much of a big factor this was. I would say, we work with extremely poor populations around the world, and that includes people who have various different types of vulnerabilities, one might say, and marginalization, whether widows, single mothers, people from ethnic minorities and so on. And there we do see certain similarities in terms of how that stigma and discrimination does affect people. But, as an example, in Guatemala, where savings group is a really important part of our program methodology. It's important for building access to financial resources, but as well as that social solidarity. And I remember once our staff coming to realize that there was a woman with a disability in that group who was constantly being sitting outside of the group, and eventually came to realize the issue was that there was a woman in the group who was pregnant, and there was a fear that having a disabled person around would infect the fetus. So there's a lot of issues like that which need to be dealt with along the way, along with many more, I guess I'd say, subtle and ingrained instances and perceptions of capacity. But of course, as with any group, there's a huge amount of heterogeneity within, people with disabilities. We've worked with men and women with disabilities who've been breadwinners in their households, respected members of their communities, and we've worked with people who have literally been shut away in their houses for their entire lives, for 40 years, because of the shame and the stigma associated with disability. And we've worked with everybody in between, so of course flexibility is really key as well.
Now, Trickle Up has been around for 35 years. We sort of got started or got more serious about working with people with disabilities about 10 years ago, maybe a bit longer. So I think the history is interesting. We talk about how do you get organizations on board, whether it's NGOs or AID or the State Department. So how did that come about? And how have we evolved?
Right. About 10 years ago, we're a member of Interaction, which as I think as Bill has mentioned, is a network of around 140 development organizations based in the US. And around 10 years ago, MyUSA, which is Mobility International USA, got a grant from USAID to promote disability inclusiveness in international development. We, as an organization, I don't think we'd really thought about disability a huge amount, but we did pretty quickly recognize, okay, we're committed to reaching the poorest, most marginalized people, the poorest people in the poorest communities, and this was, this could be an important part of our mission. So we applied for this grant. It wasn't a grant actually, so it was just technical assistance from MyUSA, and got it, and that really got the ball rolling for us. We didn't think we actually had any experience working with disability. One of the first things that MyUSA asked us to do was to do a survey with all of our local partner organizations. We work in collaboration with local community-based organizations or local NGOs around both inclusion of people with disabilities and hiring of people with disabilities as well. And then we discovered that actually there were quite a lot of people included in the programs. But neither we nor they were being particularly deliberate about it, and just like working with women, you can work with women and not take a gender perspective, and you can work with people who have disabilities and not really take on board the disability perspective. And so that really prompted us to do this a lot more deliberately and thinking about what this actually means, understanding the results in a much more deep way, disaggregating the results of our programs to understand who, what is and isn't working. And also it led us to sort of look at our own internal policies, institutional systems as well in terms of hiring and the like. So that was really important for us. And then again, largely with USAID funding, expanding our programs in Mali to have a particular disability focus. And I think what's important is that we, like many organizations, development organizations, we strive to be disability inclusive within, so we have a program and to have 10-20% of the population of that program to be people with disabilities. But it has been really important for us to also have these grants, which have enabled us to focus specifically on a target group of people with disabilities as a learning or exercise for the organization ourselves as well as for our partner organizations, which then gives us lessons to then apply to become more inclusive across all of our programs.
So a question, I guess, for all three of you. So this a theme that's emerging here is the role of institutions, accountability. So if we had to kind of quickly create a checklist or an assessment, is this institution on the job or not? Are they progressing if they've started it? What would be, maybe Charlie, you can start. What would be some of the things you would look at if you were just getting to know an organization, whether it's government, NGO, or other, for the first time, as to whether they have really engaged and are staying engaged and progressing?
Well, I think I would probably look to see if they have inclusive policies.
Okay.
And then I would review their programs to see whether, A, are they including people with disabilities in the widest sense of the programs, and B, do they have deliberate activities for targeting persons with disabilities? So really kind of taking a twin track approach there. And then I guess I would look at their own internal practice. So are they hiring persons with disabilities? And then are they working with disabled people's organizations? Are they forging partnerships with these groups in the countries in which they work? Because I think local solutions really is an important piece of this.
Judy, anything to add to that list?
Yes, I think those are all very important points. I also believe it's important to talk with these organizations about what they've been doing, where successes have been, and what areas they have need to learn more, which is, I think, what you were just saying about the money that MyUSA got. So, you know, they were able to come in and help you with some technical assistance. One, to see that this is something you were already doing, and then to be able to work with you, I presume, on what you could be doing to expand the work that you're addressing. And I think, you know, this question also depends on who you're working with. You know, so if you're working with an organization, all of these points are very important. If we're working with government, then I would look at asking some additional questions. So I think it's important to look at what governments themselves are doing. If we use the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities as an example, there are many different articles dealing with many different issues, education, healthcare, etc. But in order for these articles to become reality, governments really need to look at the development of laws that have teeth and that are being implemented. So are they working on laws? Are the laws that they're working on permissive or mandatory? What are they doing to be able to help other government workers that they have responsibility for learn more about the issue? How are they working with the disability community in their local area or country, whatever it may be, to get a better understanding of what those issues are? And I think getting to the issue of budgeting from a government perspective, I think it's very important that governments, even the poorest governments, recognize that where they are today, they're hoping to be someplace in 5-10 years, and that looking at disability as a part of the budgeting process, even if it's a penny, begins to acknowledge that this is something that government has responsibility for. So one of the things that I get concerned about a lot is, as Charlotte was mentioning, governments think that they can't do anything unless they get more money. And we see that frequently, and we've had discussions with the UN and others where people look for more money, and we say, well, the U.S. gives you a lot of money. What are you doing with the money that you're getting to ensure issues of accessibility? It doesn't mean that more money may not be needed to do some targeted work, but there should be an obligation that all should feel to ensure that the disabled people are being included. Then when you deal with major international development organizations, NGOs, I think that for us, one of the reasons why state and USAID are really looking at holding these organizations more accountable is these organizations are the ones that are doing work in the field. And we look at them as the organizations that should be able, in including disabled people into their work, to become the expert. They should be able to take their expertise, i.e. in the area of education, and apply it to ensure that disabled children are receiving an education. When I was an assistant secretary in the Department of Education in the 90s, and what I found very interesting was we would be giving through the Department of Education large grants that NGOs had won. They had a domestic side of the house and an international side of the house. The international side of the house would typically be doing nothing in the area of disability because there wasn't any money out there for them to get. But with the approach that's now being taken, which is you need to be demonstrating how you're including disability in the work that you're doing, we're seeing more of those organizations begin to step up and begin to then also look at whatever knowledge do they have in other areas and how can they apply it in the area of disability.
Joe, getting into the sort of NGO level or the local NGO, what have you seen? We generally work with sort of general agencies more focused around economic development, so this is new to them. What have we learned from our partners and around this whole question of institutional take-up and adoption and commitment?
Right. I mean, I think one thing that we've collectively learned together, and we try to have, very sort of joint learning processes with our partners, is to also be very conscious about what we do know and what we don't know, what we can be what, and what other people do have their expertise. And so what we, as I mentioned, we have very deep knowledge and very deep expertise in identifying and reaching highly vulnerable populations, marginalised populations. And again, I think there's a lot of similarities there across different types of marginalisation which serve us. But of course there's lots of things which are different and specific as well. And for that reason, working in partnership with disabled people's organisations has been really key as well. So you're combining that expertise. We've worked with local disabled people's organisations as well as international ones like CBM, which has been fantastic. And by working together, you can really deepen your impact far beyond doing it yourself, because a lot of these disabled people's organisations often have limited experience in livelihoods, even though they see it's something very important. So that's something which has also opened up new doors for expanding our program, and now we're working in Nicaragua with CBM as well.
CBM is the Christopher Blind Mission. It's a German-based organization that originally was working just in the area of blindness, but it's really expanded its work.
Thank you. And I guess I would say also with any type of good development programming, it's about creating spaces and proactively doing so by which the people you're trying to reach have a real voice in the design of the programs, and that includes people with disabilities, and understanding that, again, there's going to be a lot of aspirations and needs and opportunities which are going to be common, and there's going to be some which are going to be different as well. You need to take those into account, and that's going to vary by disability, by ethnicity, by gender and age and all sorts of things, and that's all part of the equation. And so that they have input into the design and feedback loops as well.
Judy, a question for you. We've talked about policy and law and so forth. So the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, or the Disabilities Treaty as it's often called, has been struggling to get through the Senate over several years. You've been on the front lines with that. If that passes, what difference will it make? In specific and kind of tangible ways? Sometimes I have trouble myself kind of understanding what all these sort of high-level policy things mean day to day. So if that passes, what would that mean, perhaps for Trickle or one of our partners in Guatemala? How will it change things? And I guess conversely, if it doesn't pass, because it's fighting hard, the advocates are fighting hard. I don't know what will bring about political change, and I'm not here to talk about that. But what difference does this treaty make?
So I would divide it again. What difference does ratification of the treaty mean for the U.S.?
Okay.
And what difference does it might mean for a trickle-up that does most of your work outside of the U.S., right?
Mm-hmm.
So the Disabilities Treaty, or the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, is a treaty that was adopted by the United Nations in 2006. It's based on many of the principles of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Its intention is to give voice to disabled individuals, and government take responsibility for the development of laws and practices that will enable disabled people to take their rightful place in society. 147 countries have ratified the treaty today. For us in the United States, we have signed, we haven't ratified. What we argue, we have papers outside if you want to pick them up. We believe that as the world is becoming smaller because of globalization, it's very important that Americans who have disabilities have the same opportunities to study, work, and travel abroad. And this is for civilians and for disabled veterans. And that the voice of the United States, because we've been the leader in the area of development and implementation of civil and human rights legislation over the years, that our failure to be able to be an active player at the table is also adversely affecting the knowledge that other countries and civil society have about how you work with civil society, the importance of a knowledgeable, trained civil society. Because in the U.S., if you look at not just laws in the area of disability, but for now we can just mention that, after our major laws were passed, government has put money into the provision of technical assistance, both for disabled people within the country as well as for organizations that now are no longer allowed to discriminate based on disability. So there's been a lot of time and effort put into developing laws, making sure people understand what the laws enable, but also having strong implementation provisions. So if one believes that one has been discriminated against, there is a place, not just in the courts, that you can take action. Our failure to ratify the treaty really results in our not being able to actively participate in those discussions. I think it's fair to say that myself and Charlotte in our jobs are regularly going around and meeting with government and civil society talking about the work that we've been doing, but if we ratify this treaty, then it allows us as a states party to also both look to other countries that haven't ratified, to encourage them to ratify, but I think equally important now, because of the number of countries that have ratified, is to also as a states party speak with other governments, and because we have such a strong emphasis on civil society and the voice of civil society, to work with civil society and to encourage others to really step up to the plate and do a better job of really taking the issue of inclusion of disabled people in society more seriously. So, for us, I think we hear more and more actually from civil society organizations in particular that they feel it's really important for the U.S. to ratify, either because their country hasn't yet ratified and they want us to be pushing their countries, but equally importantly because of the message that we can be given in really helping people learn how over a 40, 50-year period of time we have made some very dramatic changes. And I think also, from our perspective, we were learning as we were doing, but now we know so much more that countries shouldn't have to follow the same steps that we were creating, but there should be ways of helping them learn how to do things quicker, and then address issues that may be unique to their countries, that they're able to focus on those types of issues. But the failure for us to ratify the treaty, I think personally, is a tragedy.
Charlotte, I assume your job would be a little bit easier if the United States also ratified?
Well, yes, there's an article in the treaty, Article 31, that talks about international cooperation. And within that requires the inclusion of persons with disabilities at all levels of international cooperation. So definitely, I think just to underscore Julie's point, I think it would help us leverage what's going on already in the 147 countries that she's spoken about. But I also think that it allows us to have a space at the table and to really provide leadership in this area. And I think it's justified because, as she said, leadership, there's been a process over an extended period of time, so there is a lot to share. And so it certainly would make my job a lot easier.
So maybe one more question for the panel, and then we'll open up to audience questions. Kind of keying off of that is we look out over, let's say, the next 5 years, and what are the milestones that you would look to say that we, the collective we, whether that's individual agency, Trickle Up, the world, the big institutions, the World Bank, and so forth, they were really making progress. So I imagine that somewhere on that list will be passage or ratification of the treaty. Another example, maybe looking backwards, is I think it was about 2 years ago, if my memory is correct, there was a major report on poverty and global disability that was published by the World Health Organization.
World Bank.
World Bank. And I think put the issue front and center with lots of data, lots of information, was very well regarded. So I would guess that if we'd asked that question 3 years ago, you would have said, this report has to come out with these reviews. So what else is out there that all of us should be looking for as markers of progress?
Well, the report that you mentioned has a list of 10 or 12 recommendations. And I think going back and looking at those recommendations would be a good thing.
That's interesting.
I think, though, it would be really useful for us to have a marker where we are deliberately including persons with disabilities in our programs. I think you mentioned, Bill, or perhaps it was Joe, that in many instances we actually may already be including persons with disabilities in our program. But we're not collecting data, and we're not mindful that that's actually happening. So I think definitely better data collection, disaggregated data, disability data, and then just working with disabled people's organizations, and planning for inclusion. I mean, I think the planning part is really important. So those would be, I think, some markers that I would look to. And then obviously results. Right? I mean, at the end of it, we need to look back and say, these are the results, have we included persons with disabilities? So I think, you know, a review of results is obviously the end marker. Inclusive results.
Judy?
So I would add to that, looking at disabled people being employed within organizations. Because when organizations are hiring disabled individuals, those people then bring knowledge within the organization. I think it's the same as when you bring other excluded groups within the organization that you're working in. People bring knowledge to the organization, which helps the organization expand. One thing I think has been very interesting over at the State Department is, I would say over the last 10 years, we've seen more disabled people. I shouldn't say actually we've seen, we are now seeing that there are more disabled people who've been studying at the university level, at the bachelor's and master's level, in the area of development or related fields. And so there's an increasing number of disabled people that are being employed within the U.S. government, in part because of the Obama administration's commitment to employing disabled people. But at state, I've been really impressed with the number of people that are being brought on. Also, I think that we need to be looking at the whole concept of reasonable accommodations so that organizations recognize that there will be some people who may be employed who need some form of accommodations, and that's something that we should think about to have practices within your organization that allows for maternity leave or other kinds of supports, that there are other supports that a disabled individual may need, and it should be taken into consideration just like we look at other issues that are taken into consideration, but I think that's really important. I would say one of the markers also is training. So what is an entity doing, whether it's a civil society organization or government, to train people that have responsibility for whatever it may be, to look at how to be measuring whether disability is being included in the work that's being done. We had an example last year. I was in Ethiopia, and we were asked for a meeting with the entity that does transportation. They are building the first light rail system in all of Africa in Addis. And they wanted to know what to do to make the system accessible. So we were able to work with them to help. They came to the States, they looked at different light rail systems. But the problem that existed there was that they contracted out, and in the contract that they put together, in the bidding, they didn't say anything about accessibility being a part of the obligations of the contract that would be awarded. So that major issue, the contract was awarded, the provision wasn't in there, they came to us late, so we've been able to give them some recommendations which will help what they're doing be more accessible than it would have otherwise been. But things like that, when you're working within a country and you're working with whomever, where contracts, for example, may be being awarded, looking at ensuring that disability is appropriately integrated into those contracts is really important, because now with the requirement of the CRPD, of the Disabilities Treaty, in the area of physical accessibility, for example, there is a growing desire for this to happen, but a lack of knowledge on how to make it happen. So again, it gets back to training and making sure that when money is being spent either directly through the government to employ its own workers or to contract out. I mean, many of you, I presume, travel quite a lot, and you go to countries where there's lots of new construction going on. So just look where that construction is going on and see how many ramps you have on the corners, where schools are being built. you know, are they having bathrooms built in them at all? Because we also know that if a bathroom isn't built in a school, it also results in non-disabled girls not going to school. But, so I think those are just some of, and data, I think data collection is really important and complicated. Because many countries aren't yet collecting data in other areas, but they need to be collecting better data including disability.
Joe, as you look out over 5 years, through the lens or spectrum of trickle up, what would be the markers you would look to, one or two, to say, yes, this organization is really making progress?
With Trickle Up, we understand our success and impact in two different ways. One is on the people that we work with directly on the ground. And we are committed to continuing to expand our disability inclusion, which means, as we've talked about, both including more people with disabilities, as well as being very cognizant and being very deliberate in terms of making sure the program we're providing is meeting their needs. And what's great is you do see very transformative changes if you do it right. Not just in the economic sphere, and again, we only work with households in extreme poverty, so people starting to build, small businesses, livelihood activities and so on, that, bring in a certain degree of food security and so on, but equally as important is the transformational effect in terms of sense of self, sense of belonging in the community and the household and so on. And both those things are really key. So that's one area where we understand our impact, and we're very committed to continuing to measuring these issues and disaggregating our data, ensuring we are reaching people with disabilities and they are being affected. The other area, which I think is just as key, is how we are leveraging what we're doing on the ground and what we are learning from that to have an impact beyond the people whom we reach directly. And this involves how we engage with governments and other bodies, and also how we help people with disabilities to mobilize themselves to be demanding their rights. So for one example, in our program in Guatemala, it's not easy finding highly marginalized people who are invisible, often even within their own communities and so on. These are not people who generally come out and put up their hands and say, yes, I want to be in a project. Often it takes 7-10 visits to actually build up the confidence of people who have never had the opportunity to engage in a program to sort of come out and have this public role. So we engaged, so we partnered with the municipal government, particularly as a women's office, but the municipal government in particular was agreed to help us find people with disabilities in these rural areas. They had lists, but they were far from complete, so it was a learning experience from them. Partway through our project, there was a fairly major earthquake in the areas we were working, and so the government had dispersed a bunch of resources to help people rebuild. And because this municipal government, first of all, knew where people with disabilities were in these communities, but also had a greater understanding of the fact that they didn't know before, and that there was this marginalised population out there who would generally not receive these benefits. Usually it would go to the heads of households who can come up and knock on their door and cause a fuss politically and so on. That meant that they were actually able to go out there and very proactively seek out the people who needed support. And so that's one of the other ways which we really do seek to continue to leverage the work that we do to have that greater impact. And it's not just at the local government level, it's also at the national level. Based on some of the learnings in our projects, we've been invited to present to the National Disability Council of Guatemala, which is responsible for implementing the Convention on the Rights of Disability. In doing so, we invited along participants from these isolated rural indigenous communities with disabilities to talk as well, so it's about bringing them into the fold and having their voices heard. So in terms of some milestones, it's the continued reach and impact on the people on the ground, as well as how that is then leveraged to within government bodies. And so we've been and these are some of the things we're beginning to see, but there's certainly some on the horizons. We're being invited to present to the government of Ecuador and so on, and integrating those learnings also in the technical assistance that we provide to UNHCR and other agencies which are seeking to incorporate livelihoods programs among vulnerable populations.
It's interesting, in a number of these comments, the importance of information, of data, of building up evidence. as well as the notion of partnership and how important that is. And I suppose let's think about what would the metrics be for Trickle Up 5 years out. How many partners do you have? Have we built up more data, and so forth. So now I want to open up the floor to questions, comments, observations. Anybody in the room? Okay, we have two. So South, I'm sorry, I forget your first name.
Sure. I think they may want you to speak into the microphone because they're taping it.
Thank you. my helper is a moderator. She's done a lot of pads.
My name is Shelley, and can you talk a little bit about the special demands or opportunities for including people with cognitive disabilities in your development work?
Floor is open. Any or all?
Well, I mean, I believe that the same model has to be followed. So what's happening in the area of people with cognitive disabilities is you're seeing an emerging movement over the last 10, 20 years of maybe longer, of families who have children with cognitive disabilities, where families are becoming stronger advocates in countries around the world and beginning to demand more of government. And in part, the work that they've been doing has really also been addressing the issue of stigma, because families themselves have been basically willing to say, my children, one of whom may have X disability, cognitive disability, whatever, we believe has a right to be able to make contributions. They need to receive education. Employment is important. And so I think those messages being seen multiplying in countries around the world is very important. But I think the other component of what's been going on is we're also seeing the emergence of the voices of people who have intellectual disabilities themselves in the creation of self-help or self-advocacy organizations, where those people themselves are learning how to articulate what they believe they've achieved and what they believe they need. I think in many ways parents still are not as organized as they need to be in many countries around the world, but we like to talk from the US perspective of things that we have done supporting the establishment of parent-based organizations that can become knowledgeable about what their rights are under our laws. So again, this repeated thread of work on getting legislation through, but people aren't going to know what the legislation is about if there isn't a way of helping them learn about it. And I think also implicit in a lot of the work that goes on is an expectation that when you're training people to give them knowledge about what the law says, you're also expecting that people will use the complaint procedures and others. So I think that kind of stirring of the pot you're seeing in many areas. So if you think about the voices of people with developmental disabilities, intellectual disabilities, 20, 30 years ago was really almost non-existent. But today, you see people of all types of disabilities who are a part of the international movement, or very much a part of the development of the CRPD. And I think there's good progress that's being made in that area. But I also think it means that when we talk about reaching out to the disability community, that we need to be talking broadly. So, we speak about the fact that many people with disabilities, you don't see their disabilities, people with intellectual disabilities, people with mental health disabilities, other forms of invisible disabilities. So people who are working in these fields need to also recognize that it goes beyond wheelchairs, people who are blind or deaf, and people who look like they have a disability, somebody with Down syndrome, for example.
So, I'd just like to add to that. I think it's a really important question. Just to say that USAID has a policy, a disability policy, and it speaks specifically to the issue of non-discrimination across all disabilities, and makes special reference to the inclusion of people with intellectual disabilities. But I just wanted to underscore, I think, something that Judy was saying, and that is, even within the disability movement, particularly in developing countries, the issue of intellectual disabilities has been quite neglected. So there's also a sense that we need to build capacity within the disability movement for people to start thinking cross-disability and focusing on a group that has typically been very, very marginalized. And to a point that Judy made earlier on, I mean, we know what we shouldn't do. I mean, there's certain things that we know we just should not do. And so one of the issues is, you know, the building of institutions. And so when countries are thinking about how do they care for people with intellectual disabilities and developmental disabilities, we can say that is not a good practice. You know, skip 20 years, 30 years, and start looking at how do you develop community-based services to be able to accommodate persons with intellectual disabilities. USAID has done a few projects that have included, particularly focused on persons with intellectual disabilities. Many of them have been in the area of employment. So, you know, it's doable, and I just think, you know, it's something we really need to start, you know, it's that additional deliberate piece that we need to think about when we're designing for persons with disabilities. It's not just wheelchairs, it's not just people who are blind. I mean, the scope is much broader than that, and we need to be thinking that way. And just to say, for those of you that work in the area of, you know, women's rights, this is an area that's really important, particularly for women and girls with intellectual disabilities, in terms of the gender-based violence space. And again, you have to be deliberate about it because they're not going to come to the table, neither through women's groups nor through human rights groups. So there has to be a deliberate focus on it.
Yeah, if I could just add, I mean, I think it is a really key question. When I think about Trickle Up's programs, about 15% of the people with disabilities we work with have intellectual or cognitive disabilities. And I think if you talk to our field staff, they'll probably say this is the area where I think they've struggled most. You know, and there's real challenge that and they do struggle to find disabled people's organisations within the countries they work, which do focus on these issues that can be support as well. And I mean, one of the principles by which we work by is that even though we try to take a whole of household approach, if there's, you know, somebody in the household who, when we're working with people with disabilities, or we're working with sort of with women in other contexts and so on, that we try to make them the centre of the intervention somehow. And that's where we have found that we have had to be quite flexible in terms of how we do engage with people as well. You want them to have ownership over, you know, livelihood activities and so on. It's important for their sense of self, their independence and income. But it's also about that process of learning how best to involve others in support roles while having that person with the disability maintaining that sense of ownership and reflecting their aspirations. And I think it's a tricky process. It varies hugely from person to person, household to household, and so on. But it's certainly an issue that we're very conscious of, and I think it's something which we're really trying to learn more about.
And I think the issue here is learning. So that's why I think it's very important, the ability to really share information, because where you're working, there may not be a lot of knowledge and expertise. And expertise, I probably don't want to use that word because I think it seems to imply that you have to have a different kind of knowledge when working with disabled people than with others. So what I really prefer to look at is encouraging the people that you work for you to really try to develop solutions to problems, which I'm sure they are doing. Then I think it's also important to document it in a way that, you know, you can put positive stories out that are not demeaning stories, but are just stories reflecting work that you've done with so-and-so, and this is what they're doing, and these are things you had to do to make it happen, and this is what's changed. But I think that's very important to really share stories and to realize that you are all the experts in your area, and other people can help you as you go along.
So, go to Mike, please.
I was curious if you could give us some examples of where disability inclusion has really worked, whether it's at a country level or an academic institution or corporate, and what were the drivers for success? Was it leadership? Was it awareness? Was it like you spoke about Obama state, where like so many people have come in because of leadership, because of real effort for inclusion. So just, maybe a couple of things, examples that you can use as like role models, like looking forward to see how disability inclusion potentially could be more widely adapted.
So I think the issue of construction is very important. So in the US, we've had laws for 40 years now that have required buildings that are being built be accessible, and they have to meet a federal standard. The state may have a stronger standard, but they have to meet the federal standard. So I think if you look at universities and community colleges today, and you compare them to the 1970s, for those of you who are old enough to know that, you can remember that in those days, I went to a university, I went to Long Island University in Brooklyn. Very small campus. At that time, there was one dormitory. It had 2 steps into it. We were advocating to get a ramp. The newspaper did a story on the need to make the campus accessible. They interviewed, I don't know why, but they interviewed the head of the psychology department, who said that students with disabilities who had physical disability just shouldn't come to this school because it was psychologically damaging to us. So today, the university is accessible, as are thousands of community colleges and universities around the country because they were required to do so. I am a fanatic on laws. I do not believe that people do things out of their good heart. You have a few people, who may know this and see it's the right thing to do. But at the end of the day, the changes that we've seen in every major area, I don't care what country, is because somebody has said, no, this is not legal, you cannot do this, and this is what you have to do in order to address it. So, in 40 years here, there's still a lot that we have to do, but our buses are now all accessible, all new buildings that are being built are accessible, and if they're not, you can file a complaint against them. If you look at our sports stadiums and things like that, they're amazingly accessible. It's not because somebody woke up one morning and said, oh, I think this is a great thing to do. It's not, So, that's what I think we really have to share with people. It's things must be done, it shouldn't be permissive, you need to be changing things over time, and we need to work collaboratively with civil society and with experts to make sure that our standards are continually elevated. And when that is happening, we have seen major changes that are going on, both in completion rates of high school graduation for disabled individuals, entrance into universities, completion at university level and beyond, way beyond what we saw 40 years ago.
Other
So
questions?
can I just say something?
Sure,
Because
sorry.
Judy's fanatic about law. I'm fanatic about participation. I really think, having disabled people's organizations, having voice, having agency is so, so important. And I think we've seen that, societies that are inclusive tend to be more democratic. And so I really like to emphasize that piece because I think that it's essential, along with the laws, but for people to own it and to really push the demand side of the equation.
Yes, sorry. There's a mic over there.
Judy, my name is Tony. I think you got a hot spot on me when you said that we had failed to ratify this commission.
Good, I hope you
We
get
failed
really
to
hot.
ratify any number of things.
I know.
On environment, on disabilities. What can we do to help?
Okay, so Bill will have to answer that
That
question because I'm with the government and I'm not allowed to tell you what to do.
You're not allowed to do it.
All I can say is the Senate, 2/3 of the Senate has to vote to ratify the treaty. We have had 61 senators who have voted for the treaty in the past. We would like to be able to get to 70 senators who will be able to do that. And then democracy has to play its role to help us get to that 70.
So if, add on to your point, Judy, to keep you out of hot water, if anybody here wanted to become more knowledgeable about the treaty itself, Charlotte as well, where would you suggest a person might go to be informed if they want to get involved? Petitions, advocacy,
There's an
writing?
a civil society organization called the United States International Council on Disability.
Okay.
I'm sharing information
Right.
with you. And, sorry? And our website, which is the State Department's website, which is www.state.gov. Say it louder. Oh, sorry, state.gov/disabilities-treaty.gov.
No.
No, that's just Google it. Oh, so as I said earlier, we have papers outside. So we have a paper outside, which is a one-pager on our office. We have a paper outside on why we believe it's important for business, why we believe it's important for veterans community, why we believe it's important for one or two other communities. So, and on the very bottom, it tells you where to look.
So that, we could probably stay here a couple more hours, because this is that interesting, it's that big a topic, and you guys are so terrific. But I actually, because we're coming up on 8 o'clock, want to take the privilege of the last question. And it's a question for you guys, not for you guys. What can you do? Thinking about even what you've heard here tonight, whether you work for a company, an NGO, in your personal life, I'm going to take a risk here and ask maybe 1 or 2 or 3 people will stand up and say how this conversation has changed you. What are you going to take home that's different? And let me start the bidding, if you will, by saying, well, there are a lot of things that stuck with me, but I want to go back, and we have, as proud as we are of all of our accomplishments, I think we need to take a harder look at our hiring practices, the composition of our board. You made the important number of points about participation and organizations demonstrating through their actions that they're fully in the game. So I will sort of commit that we will find the time and the space to look a little bit harder, look a little bit deeper. I want to make sure we don't get into too congratulatory, self-congratulatory a mood. We're going to pick up on a photo op here in a day or two. But the work continues. So who else has something that they're going to do differently tomorrow or next week because of the conversation? Thank you.
Just looking at my notes, sorry, my name's Ben. The biggest thing for me, I think, is education. I didn't know about the CRPD. I didn't know about some of the other issues that are out there, and I think that when also you talk about stigma as well, globally, it really is education that's going to make that change. I think that's the
Where do you work?
at Deutsche Bank.
Oh.
Thank you. Who else? Anybody else have something to share? If you wouldn't mind, yeah. I'll let Judy insist.
So, personally, I work at Prudential, and we're building a new building in a whole company in Newark. So, and I know one of the girls I work with, her dad is on construction on the team. So I'm going to ask her tomorrow if there's any sort of disability, like how they're incorporating that, because it's a huge task and undertaking, and I'm sure they're incorporating it somehow, but I never really thought about like how that comes into play with construction. So I'm just going to.
So I think a suggestion also, because they do have to follow laws, both federal laws and if New Jersey has stronger laws, but the company could also invite disabled employees who are concerned about the access to also be involved, because there's the minimum standard that they have to follow, and then there may be other things that the company is looking at doing anyway, because as companies are building new buildings, there are all kinds of new features they're putting in, and just to really have a group of people who can consult with them and participate in the process. Make a big deal out of it as they're doing it.
Yeah.
1 or 2 others? How many people here manage staff, do hiring from time to time? Great hands. Okay. So I won't put everybody on the spot, but I hope somehow you'll go back tomorrow and think a little bit differently about recruiting, advertising for jobs, hiring, workplace environment.
Internships
Thank
are
you.
a big issue, and I think if you have internship programs, then reaching out in the community to the high schools, community colleges, universities. I think it's really important for those of you who do recruitment on college campuses to also let the college campuses know that you're recruiting across the board, including looking for individuals who are graduating in the programs that you want who have disabilities, because all of the universities and community colleges have disabled student support services. Not all students go through those offices because more and more of the universities are more accessible, so they don't necessarily need to come to the disabilities office, but they can help reach out if you're doing job fairs or anything like that on the campuses. And in your pictures, you know, simple things like if you've got pictures reflecting the diversity of your company, make sure that you have, in this case, someone with a visible disability, because although I said many people have invisible disabilities, you won't see that in the group of people that have visible disabilities. So put somebody in there who's using a cane or a wheelchair, or, you know, use the sign language alphabet if there's, you know, a word that's 3 to 5 letters that you want to. But there are good things that you can do that can become a part of your branding that also let people know. Captioning is another very important thing. Captioning of videos. I think they
Noted.
Captioning of your websites, I think that's another whole area. You know, are your websites Section 508 compliant? And you can go to the W3C and look for their tool to help you determine whether or not your websites are accessible. But, you know, it's just really looking at the environment of your organization, every aspect of it.
Charlotte, anything you want to add? I'm sure people often ask you, what can I do? How can I help? How can I be a part of the solution?
Well, I mean, I think it's really being deliberate about including. And so, you know, I think Judy's kind of said it all, you know, looking at interns, but thinking about it, looking at programs. Deutsche Bank, thinking about, you know, what your banks look like in terms of the interaction between client and services. I'm just picking on you. But I mean, I think just thinking about how you can be more inclusive. And then I think it's also really important to think, you know, very often we'll hear groups that say, well, we do work on youth empowerment. We don't work with disabilities, as if you don't have youth with disabilities. So it's really stepping into that kind of larger frame of inclusion and being deliberate about it.
Oh, yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. We'll finish with that.
So I was thinking our school, our elementary school is going through a whole playground renovation. And it's a huge nightmare, and for a lot of reasons. But we're putting in more ramps so there's more ends of it. And it got me thinking about, as we were sitting here, how do kids who are in wheelchairs or who use crutches or whatever get into the school? And I was having a hard time. As somebody who started high school unable to walk, it was really tough. And so I just try to think, like, where is the ramp? And then I realized the ramp is all the way in the back. And it's the back door. And maybe somebody thought, well, it's landmarked, so we don't want to ruin the face or the side. And so I'm just wondering, is access in that situation all we're looking for? Or it seems to me it still makes a person feel like a second-class citizen within the school, not to be able to access with all the other kids. So I'm just wondering, where are we with that? You know, it's one thing to check the box, but it seems to me we send a really powerful message on how we check the box.
So whoever you were talking about, Prudential? Yeah, building a new building and what to do. So I would say that, you know, if a school is being renovated, that's the time. Even historical buildings are required to make themselves accessible. So looking at asking the questions up front, what is going to be done if this school is being renovated to make sure access is an integral part of the redesign. But for the playgrounds, because there are standards on playground accessibility, you should go to the website for the Access Board and look at their playground standards, but you should also ask whoever you have as a contractor who's helping you get your equipment to talk with them about what types of equipment are available so that all people can use it. I mean, the best place I've ever been was in Puerto Rico when I went to visit a school, and they had really accessible, it's my phone, sorry, really accessible playground equipment, and I, for the first time in my life, was able to get up a ramp into one of the, whatever it was, I don't remember now, but it was like great. And so it's out there, and you just need to ask for it.
I want to thank everyone for being here tonight. You've learned some things, you've been stimulated, you'll take action. Especially I want to thank Charlotte and Judy and Joe, not only for being here and participating in the panel, but for the work that you do each and every day. A little bit, a bit of a commercial for Trickle Up, and it's appropriate, I suppose, that Beth was the last speaker. So we have a campaign or an effort called 100 Women, which is to engage women to join us in our work, which is by and large focused on women, involved in fundraising, building networks here in New York. There's a flyer, a one-pager outside. If you have questions, Rhonda can answer them, or I can, or Beth. So we would love to have those of you who are new to Trickle Up, men too, get more involved. So please come talk to us. We're here, or reach out to us. And thank you again for being here, and thanks to everyone who's here.